What if it is a U.S. election, what is the sort of the point in terms of people coming from other countries? I mean, what role do you think you can have or impact do you think you can have?
I'd like to address the question of election formality. I've been with the United Nations stationed in Vienna 32 years, and I was one of the observers in the Bosnian election last year. This group was demanded by the United States of the UN and of the European Council, European Union Council, to be sent to Bosnia to make sure that the elections are democratic. And long instructions were given not only to the observers, but even more so to the 15 parties or candidates in this election. And one point was that nobody should be excluded. Even to the point that if he's a communist, if he wants to run as a communist, he should be included.
The subject of today's press conference, as I think all of you know, is to give the opportunity for a group of international observers to report on the events of this last weekend in the state of Michigan. Just to give people a bit of background, on February 22nd, the state of Michigan conducted both a Democratic and Republican primary. For reasons that I suppose only they are privy to, the Democratic Party in the state of Michigan behaved in an absolutely bizarre manner. First, on instructions from the DNC, both Al Gore and Bill Bradley removed their names from the Michigan ballot, leaving Mr. LaRouche as the only Democrat on the ballot. The Michigan Democratic Party then proceeded to announce that there was no Democratic primary in the state of Michigan, something which was a complete lie. And they began to mobilize completely contrary to the rules of the Democratic Party as they were spelled out not only at the last convention but in subsequent rules meetings that have taken place. They proceeded to urge Democrats that if they absolutely insisted on coming out to vote on February 22nd, which was the appointed day of the primary, that they should come out and they should vote for John McCain. Now, although John McCain is no longer a candidate, I think that most people here are aware of the fact that John McCain is a Republican. And why the state Democratic Party would be advocating that Democrats come out and vote for a Republican is mysterious to many, but not to all of us. Because, in fact, what we have seen since the beginning was the unfolding of a non-election in the United States. The intention last year, when we first embarked on the presidential season, was to run an election with two pre-anointed candidates, George W. Bush on the Republican side, mostly agreed by all to be a complete imbecile and totally unqualified for any public office, and on the Democratic side, Vice President Al Gore, who does indeed have unique qualifications to be the Democratic candidate. Those qualifications being that he is probably the only potential Democratic candidate for president who George W. Bush, the imbecile, could beat. And that was the way things were supposed to be. Mr. LaRouche, in fact, vowed from the very beginning of his candidacy that that would simply not be permitted to happen. He cited the fact that in past presidential elections, at least in the recent past, the President of the United States was elected by less than 20% of the potential electorate. And LaRouche vowed that in this time of global crisis, in this time when the financial system is undergoing a systemic breaking apart, at this time when the strategic crises that we face are beyond any period in modern history, that at this time he would step forward and not only make himself available for the Democratic nomination, but that he would in fact run a campaign to win that nomination based on mobilizing that 80% of the U.S. population that has sat out previous elections, that has been largely disenfranchised and without voice. And that is the way Mr. LaRouche has run this campaign. Now, Joe Andrew, who is the current chairman of the Democratic National Committee, following in the footsteps of the previous chairman of the DNC, a well-known racist from South Carolina by the name of Don Fowler, declared that Lyndon LaRouche was not a bona fide Democrat, and that any Democrat who cast his vote for Lyndon LaRouche should be informed in advance that his vote would be discarded. And it is with that that this campaign has proceeded. And so what we and Mr. LaRouche's principal campaign committee did was we turned to the LaRouche Ballot Defense Fund and we asked them to help us put a spotlight on what was going on in Michigan. From that, a group of international observers was put together and traveled to Michigan to observe the electoral process in the United States. I don't think the irony of that is lost on anyone, that in this country, which is so meticulous about giving instructions to countries around the world, to China, to Bosnia, to Sudan, to Nigeria, to make sure that they understand how democracy works, to make sure that these lesser nations understand how to conduct fair and honest elections. How ironic that this arbiter of fair and honest elections globally would itself be the subject of a group of international observers. But in fact, it's what was called for, it is what occurred, and I trust that you will find the results shocking.
I find it particularly ironic, as Debbie indicated, that we in the United States, who the world looks to as the model for a democratic institutions and for free and fair elections, have had to call on international observers to help us reassert that right in the United States. And the only avenue available to us is to call on the judgment of the entire international community to put some pressure on the United States to try and rectify this situation and guarantee that we have free and fair elections. I would like to ask the observers now to give you their firsthand report to give you a flavor of what actually happened. But first, let me just introduce the whole panel so that you know who's here. Sitting to my left, or to the far left, I'll start there, is Ortrud Kramer, who is representing the International Progress Organization. And next to her is Dr. Godfrey Binaisa, the former president of Uganda and the former attorney general of Uganda, and the current chairman of the African Civil Rights Movement. Next to him is Dr. Ernst Winter, a professor at the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna and a former official of the United Nations and somebody who has participated in observing and supervising elections in various countries. To my right is Amelia Boynton Robinson, the leader of the fight for the voting rights in the United States, the leader of the march in Selma, Alabama on Bloody Sunday, which was commemorated last week, the 35th anniversary. Sitting next to her is Dr. Hunter Huang, the chairman of the National Committee for the Reunification of China. And next to him is Gabriela Liebisch, the editor of the German news weekly Neue Solidarität. These individuals, along with the civil rights attorney J.L. Chestnut, also of Selma, Alabama, came to Michigan. We observed about 12 caucuses and had a number of had discussions with both officials and voters and citizens, and observed the proceedings in which exactly the things that were threatened were carried out. That is, voters who wished to vote for LaRouche were prevented from doing so. Campaign workers for LaRouche were prevented from distributing literature and campaigning for LaRouche, and including some of the observers themselves were denied access to the proceedings. Mr. Chestnut was actually barred from observing the proceedings at one caucus.
Good afternoon. I was for 32 years an international civil servant. I'm now retired. My post was a D2 in UNESCO, UNEP, and UNIDO. And now as a hobby, being a trained political scientist, as a hobby, I help some of the new nations to set up their constitutional formalities, particularly as concerns elections. When I was asked to come to the States as an observer for the LaRouche campaign, and I heard these particular rumors, I was skeptical. I couldn't believe that this was possible. The countries I've been assigned to, like Ukraine and Bosnia and Slovakia, Slovenia, they look up to the United States, and they think the American Constitution is the ideal constitution for a democratic republic. They copy many of the clauses and customs, including elections. And so I was really in doubt that procedures that are reminding myself of a different day and age would be taking place here. I should mention that the day 62 years ago today, Austria was occupied by the Germans, and the very first thing they did is they organized a plebiscite, intimidated the people, locked others up. In the first 3 days, they imprisoned 70,000 people, mainly the leading elite, and had a plebiscite. And I must now say that my major impression, I was only at one congressional district caucus, but my major impression was that I was witnessing a plebiscite. And this shook me a great deal, really, I must say that. Emotionally, I was numb for a while because the intimidation, the physical intimidation, the verbal intimidation was enormous. They were practically trying to grab me and throw me out physically, but we stood our ground. And I tried to argue with Congressman Dingell and Christopher Smith and some of the top people in the Democratic Party that this is counterproductive. They're not going to achieve anything thereby because the more negative the actions are, the more publicity they will be getting. And I have to report back. There is an agency in the UN that is interested. That, of course, is the OSCE interested. And so they were saying, and this is very interesting, that the Democratic Party was and is a private organization. They can set their own rules, and they can do what they please. And they set a rule that nobody, even as an observer to the LaRouche participation in this caucus, are allowed to come. In fact, they printed a sheet that says only observers that are for Al Gore can come. And it seems incredible that, you know, these things are done black and white. I mean, one could imagine that there's some backdoor arrangements, but to print all this up in black and white and take the risk of having it spread all over the world is very, very counterproductive. I took a picture of all this because I think it is, for modern people, very important to see this rather than to hear about it. Then, as we left, after the vote was taken, incidentally taken, also, and please do excuse me, I'm discomforted by seeing things that happened 62 years ago in my own country. It was taken, the delegates being asked to stand up. And after they stood up, then they were asked to raise their right hand high. And it was like this. It was like a whole crowd of Hitler people standing there, raising their hand. I said, it must be incredible. Because a thing like this ought to be on a sheet of paper, be put in a box, be counted, be recounted, be checked that there's no stuffing of ballot boxes, but not a movement attitude, an emotional political movement attitude. But as we left the building, some of these local people came up and said, oh, we're really sorry this happened, you know, we're surprised that this happened. And looking at the faces of these people, I saw them as being maybe car workers and engineers of Polish descent and Italian descent, people who served well, worked hard all their life long, and are now proud to be able to help in a caucus, and were actually quite shocked what their own people were doing. So thank you very much.
I was very surprised when I found out that the United States of America has taken the tactics that were used back there in the 1900s to control the parties. I'm surprised because I have seen this thing happen in the 30s, in the 20s and 30s in the South. And they're doing the same thing that they did back there in those days. I have been involved in seeing that people got the opportunity to register and to vote. I fought to see that the right to vote became a reality for everybody. And I see now that it's being destroyed. I have witnessed in Michigan that they are destroying it, and it's becoming a part of the whole nation. When I was asked to go to Michigan to observe, I didn't expect to find what I found. We went to this Union building where they were holding the caucus. And going into the building, they looked at us and they felt that we weren't there to cast a vote. They asked, "What are you here for?" We told them that we were observers. They said, "Well, you can't go into the room now," where they were registering. And that was about 9:30, between 9:30 and 10 o'clock. And they said it opens at 11 and closes at 1. For people to go down and register from 11 until 1. But can you imagine? People who are working, people who get off at 4:30, all of those folk could now come down and register because they would close. It seems as though we are reverting to the 1900s and 1910s, when I was told by a statistician that they had a slot and the votes were cast in the slot. This is when African Americans had positions. And when the poll closed, they moved that box and put the stuffed box right under. And when that's the way African Americans lost the political positions they had. And we are reverting to the same thing to say that we are not going to count the votes of Lyndon LaRouche. We are going to throw them out. Aren't we going backward instead of forward?
I'm sorry, I have a cold, an African cold, which increased in intensity because of what I saw in Michigan. It was a very bad experience. I expected something more than what I saw, and I got nothing out of it. And you are the only country in the modern world who won your independence after 8 years of bitter fighting against the British to establish the first democratic republic in the whole world. And yet you are doing so badly that you are no longer a model. You can't be a model to us when you continue like this. So when I went to Michigan, later on, after being rejected, they rejected us, they told us to sit outside in another room until Congressman John Conyers came in, who I think that was his constituency, and he talked to us, and he talked to the lady who had rejected us, who was a retired superintendent of schools in that area. I was escorted into the room by the Honorable John Conyers, congressman. I was very intimidated. I fear that perhaps I may meet the same fate as my fellow African, Amadou Diallo. I may be shot. It was so intimidating. We had gone there only to observe, to act as observers. We had no business to vote or do anything of the kind. But I was really completely, what happened sent shock waves down my spine. And it would have sent the same shock waves down the spines of all Africans if they had to be there. Very recently, Vice President Gore went to Kuala Lumpur, the capital city of Malaysia, and gave a dressing down to the Malaysia leadership. He said, among other things, that they are undemocratic, that they don't observe human rights, and so on and so forth. The Malaysians were very angry, and rightly so. And here is the same man who is now standing as a candidate to govern this country as president, doing even worse than Mahathir Mohamad, the Prime Minister of Kuala Lumpur. Prime Minister of Malaysia. It's really a shocking experience. I was horrified myself, and that's the kind of message I'm going to pass on to my fellow Africans who would like to know what's going on in the United States. Are they democratic as they pretend to be? Or is it a mere window dressing to say that they are democratic when they don't follow the first principles of democracy, of having a fair and free election?
First, I want to say the result of the vote will keep secret. I believe that's wrong. Second, Mr. LaRouche is treated unfairly by DNC. Democratic Party is not a prevent party. Mr. LaRouche's name was not on the ballot. That's wrong. Third, less than 1% of registered voters decide the candidate for 99% of people. That's wrong. I was told that the population of 9th district is about 600,000, but in Lake area percent, there were only about 40 people come to vote. Why? Fifth, I want to say, I was personally treated polite by the one who charged of the caucus, not like Mr. White, Dr. White, other people refused them to come in, but I was treated polite. But with what I observed, I believe, I feel deeply sad. Thank you.
So let me first state that this is not the first time that I speak in a LaRouche related matter on behalf of the International Progress Organization, a non-governmental organization in consultative status with the United Nations. But I personally addressed several consecutive sessions of both the Human Rights Commission and the Subcommission for the Protection of Minorities of the United Nations in Geneva at the time when LaRouche was in prison. And thus the IPO's interventions put this case, the case of Lyndon LaRouche, officially on the record of the United Nations as a case of blatant violation of human rights in the United States. The one on the background that officials of the Democratic Party had publicly stated that LaRouche votes should not be counted, I found myself in a curious situation when it was announced at this caucus meeting that one of the two other caucuses in the Genesee County had voted 48 for Gore, 2 for Bradley, 0 for others or uncommitted. There's no way I could tell whether this 0 actually meant 0. It could have well meant 8 votes for LaRouche, 6 votes for LaRouche. You simply cannot tell. Actually, the one thing we could tell was reported yesterday by the press that there were no more than 3,600 voters who came out in the entire state of Michigan. I would share the view that was already expressed by Amelia Boynton Robinson, which was shared also with people I spoke to on the site, that the disadvantage of having a caucus is certainly giving disadvantage to working people who cannot, like in primary elections, choose the time when they go to cast their vote in a period of over 12 or 13 hours during the daytime, but rather are forced to be there for as long as 2 hours in the middle of the day, which is, of course, especially disenfranchising many of those people who certainly do not work for fun on a Saturday. The other thing that I found very worrisome was the form of the ballots. People here may think it happened before, but still, when I see a ballot where you have to fill in your name, address, date of birth, telephone number, and email address, if you so have, and cast your vote on that same piece of paper and put it all into the box of the voting, that to me is not, an election. That's rather, some form of interrogation, or what do you want? On the way to Flint, Michigan, I happened to hear in the car, in the radio, I cannot tell in which program, an interview with DNC chairman, Michigan chairman Mark Brewer, who was speaking on the caucuses. He wouldn't even mention, of course he did not mention LaRouche's name, but he also wouldn't even mention that there was the possibility to write in a vote or vote uncommitted or whatever, even though the ballot very clearly indicated that. This is, of course, also again a very, big sign of undemocratic behavior. Besides the fact that the OSCE guidelines for fair elections that are being, presented to other countries clearly have a paragraph that equal representation in the media of all candidates running is mandatory for democratic elections.
Well, my experience was quite shocking. I was at this caucus in the UAW building in East Jefferson 8031 in Detroit, where Martin Luther King's attorney, J.L. Chestnut, was gooned away. He couldn't go in. They wouldn't let him in, even though, according to the law, I understand, every presidential candidate has the right to have his observers in such caucus meetings. I was let in. Why was I let in? Because I told them that I represent a German weekly, and I had my press card, and they let me in. I have to tell you that, of course, it was clear to me that caucuses are not secret elections. But I imagined them to be a kind of discussion where people would come, registered democratic voters who live in the area, and they would bring up issues, what is a concern for them, education or drugs or housing, or they would discuss these things, and then representatives of the various presidential candidates would get up and would make a speech in favor of the candidate they are favoring. And then in this context, we would see LaRouche supporters come up with a speech in favor of LaRouche and explaining to people that they were able to write in LaRouche's name on this ballot. And what it was, I really have to say this, it is nothing, there was no discussion whatsoever. And also no speech in favor of any presidential candidate. It's just a method to avoid secret free elections in the form of a primary. And that is what I have to report in my newspaper back in Germany. It is the caucus process as such, as it has degenerated apparently, has turned into a mockery and a travesty of free elections. First of all, Mrs. Kramer said, you have to fill in name and address and everything, and in front of in the entrance hall where the registration takes place, accumulation of goons, really big people with arms and with yellow arm ribbons, sergeant in arms is written on it. So, and the people would be told, you have to not only write in your name, you have to vote right there. You have to cross the candidate which is on the ballot, or to write in what you want right there. If people didn't, if they had not themselves being intimidated in this way, they actually didn't have to. they said, I have to think about it and you cannot force me. So, but most people are intimidated and do it. I was not allowed to inspect the ballot boxes. In fact, when I tried to take just a picture of the 3 ballot boxes, Gore, Bradley, other, they didn't let me do it. And in fact, my tape recorder was thrown to the ground and it was a big brawl, and I thought that was the end of it. Then it somehow calmed down because one of the LaRouche supporters present, Bill Lewis, is a lawyer, and he very calmly cleared up the situation. So,
Second thing, what Mr. Huang reported, I think is very important. He was at a caucus where the votes were not counted at all. People would put their ballots in the boxes, having to stand in line, 11 o'clock sharp, in a long line, in front of the Gore box, very small line in front of the Bradley box, and also a small line in front of the LaRouche box. So, but after this happened, they would take the boxes and go away without even counting them. I think this is a major irregularity. Okay, it turns out that in in the debriefing process of the various caucuses we could go to, the LaRouche vote was counted formally in a couple of caucuses, and in the major caucuses the Gore people would focus on, including the one where I was, the LaRouche vote was not counted, but it was just in the category of other. And as it stands, the LaRouche votes which were formally counted by the caucus managers in various smaller caucuses around Detroit, where I met people who told me this, they will go to the party headquarters, and there they will not be counted. So, and we were sitting around a table, and we were asking the observers, that is, we were asking ourselves, is this the standard of free and democratic elections the United States government, Madeleine Albright, and the Endowment for Democracy is demanding from other nations around the world to observe?
Thank you. Let me also mention that there was another international observer on the who observed the caucuses from Poland, Mrs. Hania Warnke, who was unable to be with us today, but she also will be filed a report with us after the caucuses, and her findings will be incorporated in our final report. I would just like to say how grateful I am as an American, and on behalf of all the American people, that we have such distinguished international observers to come and help us. We need this international help at this time, and as Dr. Bernice has said, we need this help so that we can help the rest of the world, because it's the United States leadership is needed right now, and unless we can open up this election process to Mr. LaRouche's campaign and to stop this kind of intimidation, then the world will be in a very sad shape.
The subject of today's press conference, as I think all of you know, is to give the opportunity for a group of international observers to report on the events of this last weekend in the state of Michigan. Just to give people a bit of background, on February 22nd, the state of Michigan conducted both a Democratic and Republican primary. For reasons that I suppose only they are privy to, the Democratic Party in the state of Michigan behaved in an absolutely bizarre manner. First, on instructions from the DNC, both Al Gore and Bill Bradley removed their names from the Michigan ballot, leaving Mr. LaRouche as the only Democrat on the ballot. The Michigan Democratic Party then proceeded to announce that there was no Democratic primary in the state of Michigan, something which was a complete lie. And they began to mobilize, completely contrary to the rules of the Democratic Party as they were spelled out not only at the last convention, but in subsequent rules meetings that have taken place, they proceeded to urge Democrats that if they absolutely insisted on coming out to vote on February 22nd, which was the appointed day of the primary, that they should come out and they should vote for John McCain. Now, although John McCain is no longer a candidate, I think that most people here are aware of the fact that John McCain is a Republican. And why the state Democratic Party would be advocating that Democrats come out and vote for a Republican is mysterious to many, but not to all of us. Because, in fact, what we have seen since the beginning was the unfolding of a non-election in the United States. The intention last year, when we first embarked on the presidential season, was to run an election with two pre-anointed candidates, George W. Bush on the Republican side, mostly agreed by all to be a complete imbecile and totally unqualified for any public office, and on the Democratic side, Vice President Al Gore, who does indeed have unique qualifications to be the Democratic candidate. Those qualifications being that he is probably the only potential Democratic candidate for president who George W. Bush, the imbecile, could beat. And that was the way things were supposed to be. Mr. LaRouche, in fact, vowed from the very beginning of his candidacy that that would simply not be permitted to happen. He cited the fact that in past presidential elections, at least in the recent past, the President of the United States was elected by less than 20% of the potential electorate. And LaRouche vowed that in this time of global crisis, in this time when the financial system is undergoing a systemic breaking apart, at this time when the strategic crises that we face are beyond any period in modern history, that at this time he would step forward and not only make himself available for the Democratic nomination, but that he would in fact run a campaign to win that nomination based on mobilizing that 80% of the U.S. population that has sat out previous elections, that has been largely disenfranchised and without voice. And that is the way Mr. LaRouche has run this campaign.
What if it is a U.S. election, what is the sort of the point in terms of people coming from other countries? I mean, what role do you think you can have or impact do you think you have?
I'd like to address the question of election formality. I've been with the United Nations stationed in Vienna 32 years, and I was one of the observers in the Bosnian election last year. This group was demanded by the United States of the UN and of the European Council, European Union Council, to be sent to Bosnia to make sure that the elections are democratic. And long instructions were given not only to the observers, but even more so to the 15 parties or candidates in this election. And one point was that nobody should be excluded. Even to the point that if he's a communist, he wants to run as a communist, he should be included.
Now, Joe Andrew, who is the current chairman of the Democratic National Committee, following in the footsteps of the previous chairman of the DNC, a well-known racist from South Carolina by the name of Don Fowler, declared that Lyndon LaRouche was not a bona fide Democrat, and that any Democrat who cast his vote for Lyndon LaRouche should be informed in advance that his vote would be discarded. And it is with that that this campaign has proceeded. And so what we and Mr. LaRouche's principal campaign committee did was we turned to the LaRouche Ballot Defense Fund and we asked them to help us put a spotlight on what was going on in Michigan. From that, a group of international observers was put together and traveled to Michigan to observe the electoral process in the United States. I don't think the irony of that is lost on anyone, that in this country, which is so meticulous about giving instructions to countries around the world, to China, to Bosnia, to Sudan,